John Malcolm, who is the vice president of the Institute for Constitutional Studies and the director of the Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies at the Heritage Foundation. John, welcome to Breitbart News Tonight.
It's good to be with you.
Now, John, as I explained to our listeners in the first hour, I'm not a lawyer and I don't even play one on radio. So all of this stuff, very confusing to ordinary folks. But let's start with this. Explain to us what unmasking means. What does that mean?
Sure. So there's a law called the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Everyone's heard about FISA, which the government uses when they get court orders to spy on agents of foreign governments and also terrorists. And sometimes when they record these conversations, those people will be speaking to Americans. So there will be an incidental collection of Americans. So, for instance, Michael Flynn had conversations, now been widely reported, with the Russian ambassador to the United States, Sergei Kislyak. And so agents were listening in and recording that conversation because it was with a foreign agent. But the identity of the person who he is talking to, the American citizen, is masked. It's just covered up. All you get is a raw transcript, and you don't know who Sergei Kislyak is talking to. There are certain designated officials by the National Security Agency who can, following a procedure, unmask that individual so that the officials will now know who Sergei Kislyak was talking to. So Michael Flynn obviously had a series of communications, including his communication with Michael Kislyak, and 16 different authorized officials attempted and eventually succeeded in unmasking Michael Flynn as the person who was having those conversations with Sergei Kislyak.
So were these unmasking requests for information about the conversations with this Russian ambassador, Kislyak, or were they just about, aimed at anything? There were unmaskings for all sorts of things. What were the unmasking requests directly for? Do we know?
Well, I don't know exactly, other than obviously one of them involved the conversations with Sergei Kislyak. That's the conversation that got Michael Flynn into a tremendous amount of trouble. So when he was designated as the incoming national security advisor, after President Trump won his election but before he was inaugurated, he had this conversation with Sergei Kislyak in which he told him, look, the Obama administration is going to sanction the Russians. It's there's going to be a new sheriff in town. We have a new president coming in. Go easy, do something. If you're going to respond, do something proportional. Don't go overboard. And it is that conversation that got everybody in the Obama administration all concerned and led them to suspect that Michael Flynn was in cahoots with the Russians as part of this Russian collusion narrative, and they eventually interviewed Michael Flynn in something of an ambush interview. They violated all kinds of protocols, going to the White House and lulling him into a sense of security, and then he got accused of lying to the FBI during the course of that interview, and that's what led to all of his legal problems that are still ongoing. Late-breaking stories today in the Flynn case. But now so there were all kinds of who was behind this. You have a lot of people. You had John Brennan and James Clapper and Jim Comey and Samantha Power, who was Obama's ambassador to the United Nations, and Dennis McDonough, who was Obama's chief of staff, and Joe Biden. These were all people who requested to unmask Michael Flynn to find out who who the foreign agents were talking to, and it was Michael Flynn.
Well, who's the arbiter of that? I mean, these highly ranked officials can make these requests, to see these transcripts and have the unmasking and all that. But I mean, who ultimately makes the call as to whether or not they have given sufficient reason or sufficient basis for?
I don't know the answer to that. It's probably somebody within the General Counsel's office of the National Security Agency, but they have a protocol. I'm not even sure what the showing is, but they're supposed to make some kind of a justification for why they need this, and eventually enough people asked, and they satisfied the request, and so he was unmasked.
Okay, so let me ask you though, we know then that they were specifically asking for Flynn's identity, or we don't? I'm still confused on that.
They were asking for the identity of the person whom Kislyak was talking to.
Oh,
they
okay.
probably had suspicions based on a transcript of the conversation who the individual was, but they didn't know for sure until that person's identity was unmasked. So when they were transcribing the conversation, they obviously knew that information, the agents that transcribed it, but Flynn's name was redacted until it was unmasked.
So here's the other interesting thing.
That's, by the way, why President Obama, when they had this meeting, right after the interview, President Obama knew, he knew all about it. Jim Comey had unmasked the information. He had briefed President Obama. He knew about the conversation with Sergei Kislyak, and Susan Rice was there, and Joe Biden was there, and Brennan was there, and Clapper was there, and the only one who appeared to be surprised was the Deputy Attorney General, Sally Yates, because Comey hadn't briefed her yet about the conversation.
And this is interesting because, yes, now the date that Comey asked for an unmasking, because he's on this list, right? That was before the meeting in the Oval Office. And then we see on January 12th is when the Washington Post revealed that Mike Flynn had a conversation with Kislyak. And then
that was leaked
January,
to the Post, yes.
Yeah, that was leaked to the Post by somebody. And then on January 15th is when Vice President... what date did Joe Biden make his request? Let me ask you that.
I don't know that. I know that Dennis McDonough, who was Obama's chief of staff, made his request on the day of that meeting in the Oval Office, and Trump did not take office until I believe it was January 20th.
Wow. I mean, so we don't. Let me play for you the clip. Can I play for you a clip of Senator Rand Paul today talking about what he sees happening here? And I want to get your take on this. Let's listen to clip 1 of Senator Rand Paul. Can we?
What impact should this have on Vice President Biden's campaign for president?
Every reporter in the country now needs to ask him a legitimate question. He needs to come out of hibernation, and they need to ask Vice President Biden, what kind of person eavesdrops? Is that something that we think is a legitimate function of government, to eavesdrop on your opponents without a warrant, to illegally unmask them and listen to their private conversation? No, from the very beginning, General Flynn's been treated very poorly by his country. A guy who served 33 years has been treated very poorly, but this is an abuse of power that should not rest, and it should make every American worry that if Vice President Biden were elevated to the top office, would he again use this kind of power on political opponents? And the other side needs to realize this is exactly what they were accusing President Trump of, but he was actually acquitted on that charge. They have now found that Vice President Biden is guilty of using government to go after a political opponent.
Okay. Now, did he overshoot here? Did we know that this is what happened here?
Well, we do know that Joe Biden or somebody in his staff was one of the people who requested that unmasking. The Obama people would no doubt say, oh, no, this was a legitimate investigation, and we were concerned that Mike Flynn was somehow in cahoots with the Russians in order to help the Trump campaign. But, the rejoinder is, heck no. General Flynn was a decorated general. He was the incoming national security advisor. There was a long history of animus between Mike Flynn, General Flynn, and President Obama, and this was, payback to a political enemy. And in fact, when they had that meeting in the Oval Office, one of the things I thought was very disturbing that President Obama said to the people who were going to be held over, Jim Comey, Sally Yates, people who were going to be held over during the beginning days of the Trump administration, you need to think very, very seriously about whether you are going to brief the incoming president about this at all. Joe Biden has been shady about this. He was asked by George Stephanopoulos the other day, did you know anything about this investigation? Or were you involved in this investigation? He said no. And then they sort of played some additional information and says, well, wait a minute, I thought you were in a meeting when this was all discussed. And Biden said, oh, I thought you were asking me whether I was involved in the decision to prosecute Mike Flynn. Oh, I misunderstood your question, which struck some people as being evasive in the extreme.